Tri-Cities. It's Friday at 9 o'clock and it's time for Coffee with Karl. I'm Karl Dye from Tridec, and it is really my honor this morning to welcome our guest, Mr. C. Mark Smith. Mark, how are you this morning?
Good morning. How are you? Good morning, everybody.
Good. Mark, it's great to have you on. I have to say that we really appreciate you're a very loyal Coffee with Karl participant. You always give us feedback, which is great. And I think it's great to have you on because in so many previous episodes, we've talked about some of your work, your books that you've written about the Tri-Cities. And of course, that's our theme today, about being resilient in these hard times with COVID that we're going through now, and trying to relate some stories and talk about that. So I think we're going to have a great discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks again for joining us. We always start Coffee with Karl off about talking about our mugs, and because we have this resiliency and history theme today, I've got the old Tridec mug back out that is kind of our original logo. I don't know exactly when in the 90s, but we made these mugs when we first had a website, which, obviously in economic development, that's been a big shift that we've seen to, digital media, and websites are pretty important. That was our first one. We still got the same address going back to the 90s. So Mark, what do you have for us this morning as far as a mug or coffee story?
Well, I've got a Tridec mug from Bill Martin's era that has the triangular logo on it before you move to the new logo. But I thought, every time you do this, people come on and they have their school mugs or they have their organizational mugs. I thought maybe I'd bring on one that's a little more esoteric. This is let's see, there we go.
Yeah.
This is Admiral Lord Nelson's flag hoist at the Battle of Trafalgar on October 22nd, 1805. England expects that every man will do his duty.
I think that's a good theme in economic development, right? We all have to do our duty to pull together to make sure that we win the Battle of Trafalgar and also diversify our economy, I guess. That's great, Mark. I appreciate that. And I was just made aware that today is the 200th day of Stay Home, Stay Healthy. So we do have 200 days on lockdown. Not quite as many as it's been since the Battle of Trafalgar, but I guess it is a milestone that we're all going through at this time. So, Mark, I think most people in the community know you. You've got deep roots and extensive background, but can you kind of give us the cliff notes of the C. Mark Smith story, maybe, where you started out on the West Side, and kind of talk about your career in economic development? We could probably talk a whole hour just about that, but kick us off with that.
Sure. I was born and raised in Tacoma, Lakewood, south of Tacoma, and went to and graduated from University of Puget Sound with dual degrees in history and political science. My dad was a very successful regional mortgage banker, and we had one of the largest regional mortgage banking companies in the United States. And so I worked for him for 10 years. I guess my first job was picking the moss off from between the bricks in the front facade of the building, but ended up being responsible for our branch offices and for the marketing for the company. And that's something I always enjoyed doing, and it was a natural fit to move into economic development later. In 1968, three of us got together and ran a congressional campaign in the 6th District of Washington. I think all of us were at the time were probably, and the candidate for that matter, were all in our late 20s or very, very early 30s. And of course, the 6th District is a heavily Democratic district, and we had a Republican candidate, and he lost, but President Nixon won, and Tony ended up being deputy administrator of the Small Business Administration. Well, I was sitting at my desk in Tacoma, minding my own business one morning, and pardon me, telephone rang and it was Tony. And he said, how would you like to be regional director of the Economic Development Administration? I said, I'd never heard of it. I knew what HUD was, but I'd never heard of EDA. And he says, well, I don't know much about it either, but I'm going to send the deputy administrator out to talk to you. So I had lunch with him at the Space Needle, and I guess I passed muster. And 2 weeks later, I was a GS-16 in charge of 150 federal employees. Agency was part of the Great Society and had been created by President Johnson in 1965. Everybody, I was the only Republican in the office. Everybody else had the senior senator from Montana or the, whoever as their mentor. And so I was the only one. I was 33, and I didn't even know where the men's room was. I mean, it was, and luckily these guys all took kind of pity on me, or they wanted to do it. Actually, what they wanted to do was their job and teach me how to stay out of their way. So I spent 10 years. I spent 10 years running EDA for the 8 Western states. And so we had about $20 million a year that we could play around with. So I was a fairly popular guy at that time. When I took that job, it was just about 2 weeks after a couple of Boeing engineers had posted that billboard in Seattle that said, the last person to leave Seattle, turn out the lights. There was the story about my taking that job led off with the headline, new doctor for a sick society, or for a sick economy.
Oh, wow.
So that was the start. So, over 10 years, I learned a little bit about economic development, and so those were very interesting times. So we had we were responsible for all of the Indian reservations in the 8 Western states. So a certain part of the money went to that. And then we had inner city programs in Watts and Oakland and Seattle. I think I built 3 different urban leagues around the West. So anyway, that's how that all got started. But that was my first introduction to Sam Vopentest. I had been there about a week, and I got there in the morning, and my secretary every morning gave me a schedule of who I was supposed to call and what the meeting schedule was. And so it was 9 o'clock on the schedule, Sam Vopentest. I said, who's Sam Vopentest? And she said, I don't know, except that Senator Magnuson's office made the appointment. And so 9 o'clock comes around, and this little guy about 5'4", 5'5" comes into my office, and he looks kind of like a cross between a Jewish rabbi and a leprechaun. And we shake hands, and he sits down, and we exchange small talk. And about 5 minutes later, he pulls out a list of a piece of paper out of his pocket, and it has a list of projects that he thinks I'd like to fund in the Tri-Cities. Well, I hardly knew where the Tri-Cities were, and I didn't know anything about Sam Vopentest except that Senator Magnuson had made the appointment. Now, I'd never voted for Senator Magnuson, but he talked about each of the projects really cogently and described them in detail. And we shook hands, and he got up and left. And about 20 minutes later, my telephone rang, and it was my secretary, and she said, it's Senator Magnuson on the telephone himself. Well, I'd never. So I picked up the telephone. I said, good morning, sir. What can I do for you? And he said, I understand Sam Vopentest was just in your office. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, give him anything he wants. Click. So that was my introduction to Sam Volpentest in the Tri-Cities.
Oh, that's amazing. I think, I mentioned it before, but when I was considered as a candidate for this job and first came to the Tri-Cities for my first interview and had breakfast with some of our board members, my predecessor, Karl mentioned the fact that there was this book written by, essentially the founder at Tricknick and Tridec, Sam Volpentest. And, I bought your book on Kindle because obviously I wanted to learn more about the Tri-Cities and about Tridec's history. But then I love history too. And I was just, I got to say, Mark, it's well written. And, I've met a lot of the people that are quoted in the book since then and even had them on Coffee with Karl. And it's just, it's really a great reference for, some of the challenges and even Sam's life. I really appreciated the work that you did on Sam before he even came to the Tri-Cities, growing up in Seattle and some of his family history and career and stuff. And I really appreciate that book. I didn't bring it today, but I do have the other book that you gave me, Something Extraordinary, which talks about the Manhattan Project. And
Okay.
And that's good. So do you, off the top of your head, do you remember any of the Sam's list, that first meeting? Or, did you get offended or?
One of them isn't around anymore, but one of them was the small business incubator we built out on Logston and Horn Rapids. And the problem, pardon me. The problem with that project was that we just didn't build it big enough. It was about 30,000 square feet or so, if I remember. And an incubator, to be successful, needs to be about 100,000 square feet by the time you can raise enough money to pay for your professional staff and everything, and marketing and all the administration to make it work. And so this was we just never had enough tenants for the overhead. So of course the Port of Benton's got it now. And and it's being reformatted as a place for restaurants and breweries in the Manhattan B reactor B reactor visitor centers there. So it's turned out, but not for the purpose that we had. Oh gosh, I was trying to think of what else was on that list, but I think there were a couple of water and sewer projects and things. Sam didn't get everything he wanted, but he got the state did. One of the senators from California once accused me of saying that every state gets a project and Maggie gets the rest.
Let's take a moment. I think this is great because in different economic development jobs I've had in the past, always had a relationship with EDA, Federal Economic Development Agency, and then one of the connectors, which are economic development districts that are kind of like a local liaison to a certain extent with regional offices. But you talked about incubators, and I know because I've lived in communities that had EDA funded incubators, and I think that time period, Mark, maybe in the 70s was a growth period for incubators. But you want to just talk a little bit about EDA, and during that time period, what was the thought behind creating incubators as far as startup companies and entrepreneurism? Just give us the kind of the cliff notes on that initiative.
Sure. Back, of course, economic development in one sense goes back to the very start of the country, and particularly to the start of the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, and the start of the land grant universities by President Lincoln about the same time, and going all up into the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, economic development was essentially industrial development. It was how do southern states go to Connecticut and Massachusetts and steal the shoe manufacturers and the clothing manufacturers and bring them to the South. Or in my time in Birmingham, how do we attract Mercedes-Benz to Alabama? And I was fortunate to be a part of that team, and it was a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah.
So basically what we were talking about in economic development was industrial recruiting. And then when we went through the 1960s and we went through the racial strife that we had at those times in the creation of the Civil Rights Bill, we started dealing with business development, business retention, minority business development, Indian reservation development. Of course, now, you know, when they started to allow casinos, it was the Indian Economic Development Act of whatever year that happened. We never did an adequate job, never had enough money to do an adequate job prior to that. So we basically, for communities that weren't going to go out and be terribly successful at stealing somebody else's business or bringing business to their communities, the idea was, of course, that you would develop your own business, and we still have that, and it's morphed into technology development now with places like Fuse and that sort of thing. But we decided that, or we felt that if you could have a small business incubator, a place to take people that had good ideas and give them professional marketing assistance and management assistance, that they could graduate and they would grow and prosper in their own communities. So that was the idea behind it. And there were some major successes. There was a really successful incubator in Chicago, but it ended up being about 300,000 square feet. And our incubator in Birmingham was 150,000 square feet. Wow. And, in an old Sears store. And it took that kind of income and continue. I think in the city of Birmingham, I think we put $2 to $3 million a year into that incubator, in addition to whatever EDA had put in to set it up. I know out of my economic development budget, $2 to $3 million went to support that incubator each year. So you know that's gonna be successful. But now we're basically doing the same thing with entrepreneurism and technology development. The other thing that I think EDA was more successful at was this whole concept of strategic planning. You talked about economic development districts, and for those that aren't familiar with them, EDA said, okay, if you're a city or you're a county or you're a state, it's fine to come and ask us for money, but we want to know that you've done some planning and that you have the wide-ranging political sign-off to support this project if we give you this grant. And so we created, we had about a quarter of the EDA's money was in planning grants. And those planning grants went to states, so they went to university centers, they went to economic development districts, which are multiple county economic development organizations in primarily rural areas. I know Governor Andrus in Idaho created the act that had wall-to-wall economic development districts in Idaho, and that was one of the first states that had done that. And so the idea of the district is to go around and work with the local towns and counties to figure out what projects are needed, and then to develop those projects and get political sign-off on them, so that we wouldn't have to be fighting the local community if we decided to come in and make a grant. So that strategic planning process was really terribly important. And that kind of leads, in a strange way, it leads to TRIDEC. Um, back, of course, back in Sam's day when they created TRICNIC, there weren't a lot of local economic development organizations around. There were a few, but not very many. And when we got into that big recession, the idea was we encouraged local communities to create uh, countywide or regional-wide economic development districts, but you would have uh, both. You'd have some political entity that would be run by Democrats and some political entity that would be run by Republicans, and they might be unhappy with each other over a whole range of other issues that didn't have anything to do with this, and it was hard to get them to cooperate. I remember when we created the Seattle King County Economic Development District, which was the first new type of TRIDEC type EDC in the state. We had to get Mayor Lindsay, the King County executive was John Spellman. We had to get Mayor Lindsay's economic development guy from New York to come out and talk to John. And we had to get Mayor Daley's economic development guy from Chicago to come out and talk to Seattle Mayor Wes Ullman to get them to agree to put together this district. But we put together the Seattle one, and then later the ones in Seattle and Spokane and otherwise. And when I left EDA, my first economic development job was to run the Tacoma Pierce County EDC when after that had gotten started.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that overview, because a lot of times in economic development, we're familiar with the agencies and the distribution. So that was a really good connection to the federal funding and even the strategic planning and the incubator side for that. So let's move on. And you talked about it a little bit, Mark, but then from Pierce County, Tacoma Pierce, I think then relatively after that, you went to Birmingham, and you mentioned Mercedes, but on this topic and theme of resiliency and economic development's role in helping with these transitions, I got to think that you like bringing in Mercedes was a huge accomplishment, but at that time wasn't Birmingham, I think of traditionally as like a steel town, right? And so maybe were they transitioning from that heavy industry into some other things, or what was that experience like? Do you have any stories about, resiliency and the role of economic development in that transition?
Well, there were still several steel mills operating when I got to Birmingham in 1988, but they soon closed. They were on their last legs when I got there. Birmingham, of course, the largest city in Alabama. Then it was about 350,000. Well, no, about 300,000, a little bigger than Spokane. Okay. And but it's a overwhelmingly majority Black city. Well, in the first place, that was something of a sea change, coming from Tacoma to Birmingham, but the Blacks had political power, but the white business community had economic power, and so we were again facing this situation of what are we going to do to diversify away from all of these high-paying union steel jobs. And as an aside to that, people remember, of course, the police dogs and the fire hoses in Birmingham during the 60s. But what people don't know is that those steel unions back in the 20s and teens and 30s were integrated. It was absolutely amazing. Hold on for just a moment. Let me credit this.
No problem. Well, I might just fill here, and I spent a little bit of time in Alabama myself. I remember flying into Birmingham and then going to Tuscaloosa. I think Tuscaloosa is where maybe the Mercedes plant was at, if I remember right.
It's located about halfway between, a little closer to Tuscaloosa. Well, just to finish off that story a little bit, Alabama didn't find out that Mercedes was looking for a location until it was down to 13 states. They didn't
Wow.
even know.
Wow.
The then governor sent the head of the state economic development director to Germany and said, y'all go call on those guys and don't come back without the plant. And so they went over and the program that we developed was about a $400 million incentive program.
Wow.
For example, Birmingham's located in Jefferson County. The Mercedes plant is located in a whole nother county, about another county away. So here's Birmingham City and Jefferson County putting $5 million into land prep into a site that isn't even in their county.
Wow.
And the idea is, of course, that Birmingham's the largest city, and when you need lawyers or you need toilet paper or you need whatever, companies in Birmingham are gonna get the orders, and that ultimately turned out.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was about I can't remember, but I can't remember what on a per capita basis what the job cost per job was, but they brought in 700 jobs.
Wow.
And they actually, I'd do that any time over again. Our job in my job in my office was to pay $250,000 out of my budget for the lawyers in New York who would put together the foreign trade zone. So that was my part of it. But we've now got 3 or 4 other automakers in Alabama, probably 150 parts suppliers. I'd do that deal anytime. So anyway, I stayed in Alabama until I retired in 2000, and then found out that the job in Richland was open. And I didn't know anything about Richland except that the sun shined over here, and we'd gotten used to the sun in Alabama. So we had to make a decision as to whether or not we were going to retire in the Gulf Coast or come back up to Washington. We decided to come back up, and it's been a great decision, just as I know you feel from yourself.
Yeah, for sure. It's my family and I just feel so blessed to be here. Me in this position to be chosen, and then we love the Tri-Cities. Even the majority of the time that we've been here, we've been under COVID. It's just such a great community, and I've talked about it before that I didn't really have much exposure to the community. It was mainly driving through, as many people do as we think about Tri-Cities. It's just they're going to Portland, Spokane, Boise or Seattle, because we're there on the crossroads. But it's just been an amazing experience for us. And, the sunshine, I'll just say the weather is incredible. And it brings up another topic we've talked about on Coffee with Karl here in some of this transition in the economic development industry from, a lot of focus, and you've given us this great historical perspective, Mark, on EDA, things like incubators, building kind of economic gardening, if you will, creating your own companies. Also recruiting. I mean, the Mercedes-Benz story is amazing, right? 700 jobs and multi-million-dollar incentive packages and probably tax breaks and stuff. We're seeing that here in Washington State now with the Boeing, what's been put together in the past, and then some decisions that Boeing makes, and then trying to balance that out on incentives and keeping and building manufacturing jobs. But then, I think this next trend that we're seeing is more about place. And so you talk about the Tri-Cities and our weather, and then the amenities and things that maybe traditionally weren't considered as part of economic development, but we're looking for ways to partner with organizations like Visit Tri-Cities and the Regional Chamber, Pasco Chamber, other chambers that are kind of focused on what can we do to make this an even better place to both attract visitors, but then for people to live. Because I think, kind of where we're going, COVID's bringing that out, is that there's this opportunity for remote workers that we didn't necessarily have there today. That when you did economic development, you talked about building, a multi-million square foot manufacturing plant and 700 jobs. Today, we can have an economic benefit by having a more amenities in your community where people choose to live, and better broadband access and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe some of that transition that's gone on in our industry and what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, um, state and federal governments, like agencies like EDA, are looking for communities like this one. They're looking for communities that get along with each other, and that has not always been the case in the Tri-Cities. And I really just wanted to take this opportunity, because I don't really know who's watching, but I really want to take this opportunity to compliment you and to compliment the Visitor and Convention Bureau and the Chamber for the degree to which you have all come together and marketed this community as one community. You do it in your own individual ways, but even that is integrated through common signage and that image and that sort of thing. And I think we're very lucky that we have at the head of each of these agencies an individual that understands the benefit of collaboration and cooperation. And I just wanted to say what a rare quality that is, because I spent 8 years, or almost 10 years, looking at the quality of communities and whether or not we should put money into them or not. And it's very rare when you see what's going on in our own community. So my only point is keep it up and add to it.
Well, thanks. Well, and we appreciate your perspective. I mean, that, we I think that we all try to do even more together, for many different reasons, to, essentially, to your point about collaboration, things that we work on together are going to bring bigger results, and they're going to bring results across, different measurement sectors. That's really good for our economy, but thank you for that.
Sure. The other thing I wanted to say, and Diane Howard and I used to work together at the city of Richland, and so I'm sure she is so tired of hearing me say this over all these years, but economic development, different people, it's a term that everybody thinks they kind of understand what it means, but it means something else to everybody.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the same thing to two different people. So back in the 1980s, I guess, the American Economic Development Council, which was one of the predecessors of what is now the International Economic Development Council, came up with a definition of economic development, and I just thought I'd share it with you. Economic development is both a process and a practice. The process of economic development is the creation of wealth through the mobilization of human, financial, physical, and natural resources. The practice of economic development is the planning, design, and implementation of community efforts that influence where wealth is going to be created in order to strengthen an area's economy by creating and retaining jobs. And that's essentially what TRIDEC does. Yeah. So it's important for people to understand both the practice part of it and the process part of it. And most frankly, people that don't deal with this every day really don't understand that. The I had another point I was going to make, but I'm having a senior moment. Go ahead, Carl.
Oh no, it's all right. I actually just I think that that's a great definition and a great way to put, you know, what we do in so many different areas into perspective. But you know, just on Coffee with Carl, I've had a couple of my predecessors on, Mike last week, and then of course Carl Adrian, and they both have made comments, and you know, I've heard this quote attributed to Carl Adrian many times, and that you know, economic development isn't about just the wins that you can bring in, but it's really about the process. If you do the process right and follow the guidelines and have an effective plan, you're going to see results over time. But you know, time is the big variable kind of in the process. And then of course, Mike last week talked about measuring results in decades in economic development and not years. And I think that both of those things are complementary and they align with that definition and what you just talked about.
Yeah, and you reminded me of what I was going to say. Um, the you know, if you're running an economic development organization, you're obviously always worried about how to fund it and what kind of community support you have, and of course, some community support equates to funding. And when things are going well, when the economy's booming, most people don't think you need to pay much attention to economic development. You can pay attention to other things. So the time comes, like the Boeing crisis, or like the Great Recession, or even the COVID problem that we're having now. And a crisis comes along, and if you haven't planned for your economic development organization, if you haven't funded it properly in the good times, then you're having to thrash around and try to hammer something together in the short term that probably isn't going to be very effective.
That's a great point. I am reminded now that we're almost 40 minutes into this, that if anybody does have any questions for Mark, we'll use the question and answer feature at the bottom of the Zoom call. If you're on Zoom or if you're on Facebook Live, you can put your questions in the comments and we'll get these questions from Mark. So C. Mark Smith is our guest today. Really noted, I would say, economic development professional with a really extensive background experience we've been talking about, and then an amazing author. I really appreciate the books that you've written. And you know, one thing that we and I just had a note too, if anybody wants to ask a question to see if they can stump you, Mark, on Tri-Cities history with your background. So we'll put that challenge out there. But before the show started, we talked about Hanford. Obviously, you've written extensively about that and in research for your many books that you've published. But talking about the economic impact, or you know, the percentage of federally funded jobs, and then you know, dollars in our workforce over time, and how that transition, obviously with TRIDEC, you know, going back to TRICNIC to a certain basis, is really diversifying our economy so that we don't have such a heavy reliance upon the federal government for, you know, local economic strength. But you want to talk a little bit about that? And you and I kind of batted some figures around that I think are pretty accurate talking about that. But it's a good example, I think, of just economic development in general. And, you know, not that TRIDEC's done all of it, but we've been here working on it and, you know, had some great wins and accomplishments over the years to help this diversification effort.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we were saying about being prepared being prepared for a crisis. When President Johnson announced that he was going to shut down, or the government was going to shut down the plutonium reactors in the State of the Union message in 1964, there was no economic development organization in the Tri-Cities. The Tri-Cities was only had a population of about 85,000 in the two counties. There was no freeway system. There was no Columbia Center Mall. There was no Tri-City Airport. If you, the highway to Umatilla was a goat trail that you crossed the river on a ferry. You cross the Columbia River at Vernita on a ferry.
Wow.
So Sam and Bill Phillip and Glenn Lee from the Tri-City Herald had everything they owned invested in their businesses in the Tri-City, and the shutdown of the reactors would have had a terrible effect on them. It was estimated, and Gary probably, Peterson probably has these figures, but my memory serves me. We had a population in 1960 of about 85,000 people. About 80% of the total workforce in those 85,000 people was either directly or indirectly tied to Hanford. And probably 90% or so of the income coming into the community. Well, they formed Tricknick, and they had some successes. Actually, Sam's successes in building this community probably had more to do with things he did. He's remembered for for being the community godfather of Hanford. But in those days, he probably had more success with creating the branch campus that is now WSU, working with Senator Magnuson to get the freeway system so that it didn't bypass the Tri-Cities, building the Hanford Highway and the Vernita Bridge, building the Richland Federal Building. These are all things that Sam thought a real community had to have. It had to have transportation. So while he worked all the time on getting new missions for Hanford back in those days, he had an awful lot of success doing other things. Well, by 1980, 85, BWHIP, the storage facility at Hanford, has been terminated. The WHOOPS is in collapse. The N reactor's been shut down, and we're going through another economic crisis. And we find that we had 144,000 people now instead of 85,000 or 80,000, but about 20% of those 144,000 people were still directly tied to Hanford, and maybe 40% of the money coming into the community is tied to Hanford. And of course, that's when, against Sam's recommendation, they went ahead and merged with the chamber and created Tridec. Well, now we have 300,000 people in the community, and about 10% of those people work for Hanford or the contractors, but about maybe 20% of the money we have coming into the community is tied to Hanford and the contractors. So we're much more diversified and much less dependent on Hanford, but it's still a big whack.
Yeah, for sure. And I do want to just add that I think those numbers that we talked about, at the founding of obviously PNL, and I think it was 1965, I believe, if that year is right. It could be off, but we also include obviously those numbers in just federal dollars that come into the community. And PNL will have another guest on next week, and we're trying to highlight PNL as that, because even with back in the days plutonium production, now with Hanford cleanup, PNL has become such a big part of that federal spend. And obviously we're all trying to leverage those dollars that come into the community. Like, how can we start new companies? How can we help them commercialize their technology and create even more jobs, for sure?
Well, and of course, when Battelle took over from Hanford General Electric, Hanford Labs, that's the other thing Sam and those guys did, was diversify the contract and split it up into a bunch of subcontracts, but one of which was Battelle's. But now, of course, in those days, their research was tied pretty directly to Hanford. Now their research is tied to all kinds of things, energy storage and clean energy, and just so many things. It's really tremendous.
It really is. And I think, coming from Idaho and having a little exposure to Idaho National Lab, which is very focused on the nuclear mission within the realm of national labs, I just think the diversity of science, research, development, and even engineering and potentially commercialization that PNL does, it's such a broad swath. I think next week we're going to talk about earth sciences, and that is involved in nuclear, but it involves so many different things. So that's a great example of some of the changes that have come to the Tri-Cities. We do have a question that relates to Sam. We're just talking about Sam and Tricknick. So Fran Forget asks, do you recall as to Sam's early history as a jazz musician in Seattle? And can you tell us any stories about, wasn't he the first, and Fran and I just talked about this, wasn't he, it was in Community Godfather, of course, but wasn't he on like a very early or one of the first radio broadcasts with this jazz quartet or band or something? Or wasn't there a story about that?
Yeah, good morning, Fran. Absolutely true. Sam, of course, was the son of Italian immigrants, grew up in what is now the Pioneer Square district. In those days, of course, as you know now, it's predominantly Asian. In those days, it was predominantly Italian. And Sam started work at 10, started work full-time at 17, delivering Western Union messages and selling newspapers, and then went to work for a wholesale grocer and spent 23 years on a set route in downtown Seattle, selling groceries to speakeasies and bootleggers and Italian grocery stores, but he played the saxophone, and there's a wonderful picture, I think it's in the book, of Sam's band. And and I can't remember for the life of me what, I'm going to look it up as soon as we're off the air. I can't remember what the name of it was, but they used to broadcast from the Rhodes department store in downtown Seattle. And they had a big room with a big glass wall, and people that were shopping could come up to the glass wall and look into the glass wall at whoever was performing live on the radio. Maybe it was a drama, maybe it was a band, but anyway, they'd be in there performing. And Sam's band was in there. God, I wish I could remember I've got the book next to me, but I won't take the time to go look up the picture.
Oh, that's great. I think
that's a great memory.
Yeah, no, and I do, like, I appreciate that, because I think that's what's great about your book, Mark, is that, it just doesn't talk about Sam's role in economic development in the Tri-Cities and working with the federal congressional delegation and their staffs to do these things, which it does a great job covering, but it also talks about him as a person. And I think that's a really interesting thing, not having a chance to get to know him. Just in reading your book, I felt like, because it does give a great overall picture of him, that we all have a connection to him. I mean, there's so many things that are here in the Tri-Cities because of the work that he did or the groups that he pulled together, to come through some really tough times. I mean, we may feel like COVID's hard, and it definitely is, and especially the families that have been affected, very negatively by it. But, there's been some really hard times here in the Tri-Cities, and so what we're trying to bring out in these discussions is we've got a long history of the community pulling together for each other, crossing many boundaries and working together to have some great accomplishments.
Well, he loved baseball, and many of the stories that are in the book are from either Bill Martin or Gary Peterson, and of course we worked for him or with him for a long, long time. Bill told me one time that Sam wouldn't talk to him. He was director of TRIDEC. Sam wouldn't talk to him, but Bill one time, Sam would listen to the Mariners or whatever the name of the team was then, and on the radio. And Bill came in and sat down and listened to the ball game with him, and Sam was a lot more friendly after that. Gary told me that when they went to get LIGO, that Sam would sit at his desk and practice laser interferometer gravitational wave observatory. So when he went back over and over again, so that when he went back to Washington, he could reel it off to the Senate and House office, senators and congressmen that he was meeting with.
That's a great story. It probably was something that had done many, many times when he was probably, memorizing the grocery list when he was selling groceries and a lot of other things too, right?
I know we're getting close, but I'll tell you one other story.
Yeah.
One time, Sam was, and I can't remember who told me this story, but somebody here in the Tri-Cities. The people that told me the story, their son had just gone into business, and they'd invited Sam and his wife over for dinner. And so they came over, and Sam complimented the young man that had just started business was there, and Sam complimented him on getting started. And he said, "Show me your calling card." And the guy took his calling card out of his wallet and handed it to Sam. And Sam said, "Do you have a you have a punch somewhere in the office or somewhere in the house?" And they said, "Yeah, I think I got one upstairs." They went and got the punch. Sam found a place on the card where there was no type and punched a hole in the card. He said, handed back to him. He said, "Now you go do this with all of the rest of your cards. And when somebody asks you for your cards, give you a chance. They'll ask you about the hole, and it'll give you a chance to give them your spiel."
That's great. But, there's so many people that are successful in things like sales or marketing. And we didn't even have a chance to talk about your marketing, Mark. So we'll have to have you back on for that. But that's a great example of, sometimes it's a little thing that just makes that connection. I think in the field of economic development, especially on the attraction side, when we're talking about, the incentives and the property and the infrastructure, there's so many things that we put together. But I think that so many times, if you get the chance to meet somebody that's a decision maker at the company, just like when you're selling somebody, I guess in economic development, we're selling our communities, right? We're selling ourselves, our organization, our community, the assets. And, I think that in today's world, even that it's not always just a spreadsheet decision, that there's also relationship building that you work on. And so that's, I think, great stories about things that Sam did that really connect to the things that we're doing now.
Well, the relationships, I think, are even more important. I mean, you do have to have a bottom line case, but going back to Mercedes, the governor of Alabama invited the chairman of the board of Mercedes to come turkey hunting with him in South Alabama. And they got along. I maybe had a dram or two of good whiskey and got along very, very well. And Mercedes came to Alabama.
You bet. I remember a story from Idaho. I wasn't involved with it, but in Twin Falls, they have Chobani, and there's a real big connection to the growth of their dairy industry in the Treasure Valley down there, and having a huge yogurt plant. But then as they got the Chobani and yogurt plant, they also had a supply chain coming in, just like you described about Mercedes-Benz. And they were trying to attract, I think it was a Portuguese dried fruit company that would supply dry fruit that would go in the yogurt, for stuff. And the story I heard was that they had the local children's choir learn, I think it was a Portuguese national anthem. And so like when they got off the plane, they kind of did, we all have so many stories about that, about trying to make that connection, because that relationship building is such a critical part of everything that we do.
Mercedes put on a huge gala at the Birmingham Convention Center, and the invitation that I got at the house said, "From your southern German neighbors."
That's perfect. Mark, we're down to 5 minutes. I've got 2 questions that I think we can get through in that time, and then give you some closing time. So Fran's got one more question, and this is the Stump the Mark question, I think. What was Sam's favorite after hours liquid refreshment?
Oh, Jack Daniels. Black Jack Daniels.
All right. The other one is, and I think it's probably a good question to go out on, is do you have any predictions regarding our Tri-Cities economy within the next 20 to 30 years? We just talked about, this progression and the impact of federal spending locally, and how over time we have become more diverse. But what's your prediction? Where do you see us going, Mark?
Well, we've got some work to do. I mean, we've certainly got work to do with making sure that a higher percentage of our young people stay in the community and create new jobs and tax base. And in that regard, things like Fuse are very, very important. Of course, the work that both CBC and WSU do are very, very important. But we can't lose track of that. And we historically have not done as good a job of that as we can. Matter of fact, that wouldn't be a bad subject for an integrated economic development approach. Anyway,
Yeah.
past that, the what is it, 1,600 acres out at Hanford that Congressman Hastings were able to get for the community. That has a terribly important future. We've got to find a way to fund the infrastructure to that. We've got to find a way to market the property, and we've got to be careful that we don't market it in such large segments and with so much technology that we have a limited number of jobs. We've got to replace those Hanford jobs, and even though Hanford cleanup's probably going to take till 2060 or something to get done, each year there's going to be less and less of it. So we've got to replace those jobs. So agribusiness, really important. Tourism, wine tourism, really important. Retail, wholesale trade, it's going to take a long time for the restaurant business and for a lot of our tourism related businesses to bounce back. I think those are the major things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's great. I think, from our perspective, you're exactly right. And those are some things that we're trying to come together and work on, or have some plans to work on in the future. I think you're right on track for whatever we know. You've got a lot more experience than we do, for sure. But Mark, I'd like to give you a couple minutes to make a closing statement. We really appreciate your partnership. When I read your book and then got, selected for this job, I look forward to meeting you. And it's been great, even though it's been a lot of, more Zoom meetings and stuff since COVID started. But you've really helped me a lot. And, your historical perspective, I think means a lot. And I think there's so many lessons that we can learn and things that we've already been through, or other communities, to your point, have been through. And that helps us guide, where we're going to go in the future and what we're working on coming up. But would you like to make a closing statement before we wrap up today?
I'm always willing to help anytime there's a question, or if I can add anything from a historical standpoint or from the federal grant experience standpoint. I'm always happy to do that. Coming to the Tri-Cities I don't think I ever, like so many of the rest of you, I don't think I ever thought that it would be such a great experience or that I'd be here very long. But it's now been 20 years, and it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's more fun because of what you and the other people are doing, because I can watch you guys do what I wish so many other organizations would have done, and that even I would have done, and didn't do it as successfully. So I think you're doing a great job. And Karl, not only you, but all of your staff there at TriDec.
Well, thanks, Mark. We do have a good team, and I sure wouldn't be able to do anything without them. And really, that's made such a easy transition for me. But thank you for joining us today. I look forward to maybe, in the future we'll have you on again, because I think we could talk for many hours about this. We did have one comment from Facebook about Sam, that he liked a homemade turkey noodle soup at Hill's Restaurant. That came in from Alyssa Johnson. So I did want to add that before we wrap up. But Thanks for your time, Mark. Really appreciate this conversation and your partnership and everything you've done for the Tri-Cities and everything we can all work on together moving forward. So thanks for your time.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to the time when we can get together for lunch and a glass of wine.
Me too. All
Okay.
right. Well, have a good weekend, Mark. Thanks again for your time. And thanks for everybody joining us on Coffee with Carl.